so we discussed meaning and how we can share it. And I suggest dialogue is a way. Now, the word dialogue, it's interesting to go into the derivations, is the Greek root dia and logos. Logos means the word, or else I would say the meaning here. And dia means through. It conveys the notion of flow between us rather than an exchange back and forth. See, the word discussion also is the same root as percussion and concussion. It really means to break things up, to analyze things from many points of view. And it also suggests some sort of game like ping pong, where we're sort of going back and forth and trying to win, right? We may adopt part of the views of the other person in order to win, but we want to convince and persuade, right? Now, in the dialogue, that's not the purpose, you see. Now, it has a different sort of flavor. And you see, I remember reading a long time ago of an anthropologist who visited some North American Indian tribe and hunter-gatherers, a small group, and they would meet fairly regularly in a circle and talk, apparently with no agenda, no purpose, and making no decisions or conclusions, and it would just sort of end. And apparently they all knew what to do then, you see. The suggestion is they were sharing meaning, you see. And that simple society was obviously easy to do. In our society, it would be much harder. Now, I would say that the basic notion of a dialogue would be for people to sit in a circle. As that geometric arrangement doesn't favor anybody. It allows direct communication, right? Unfortunately, we can't do that here because there are too many people, but you may have noticed that those who are in the back will have a hard time communicating with those who are in front. Now, and in principle, the dialogue should work without any leader, without any agenda. But of course, we are used to leaders and agendas, so we'd probably have to start with a facilitator and gradually work toward not having one. Now, if we were to start a meeting here without a leader, say you start talking and we have no agenda, no purpose, I think you would find a great deal of anxiety in not knowing what to do, right? These early people sort of took it naturally, but we have got used to the other way, right? And so one of the things would be to work through that, you see, that there is going to be this anxiety, but you have to face it, right? And I suggest that if people did this for an hour or two, they would, and in fact we know by experience they do get through it, right? Now, and start to talk, right, more freely. Now, if we try to have a dialogue, we'll find various obstacles in the way, you see. First of all, we find that some people talk easily and tend to dominate conversation, and others find it harder to talk, or perhaps they don't have that confidence, they're afraid to make a fool of themselves. Some people are not worried about that. And that creates a lot of frustration, you see, and all around. And this also tends to impede the dialogue. People stop. You see, people tend to ask when they get together, why are we together? There are two reasons of why a lot of people would get together. One would be for entertainment and pleasure, and the other would be to do something useful, right? Now, in this dialogue, we're not going to be always entertaining, nor is it doing anything visibly useful, right? So you would tend to drop it, you see, as soon as it got difficult. But I'm going to suggest that it's very important to go on with it, right? Now, see, to stay with it through the frustration. See, when you think something is important, you will do that, right? You see, nobody would climb Mount Everest unless for some reason he thought it was important. It's very frustrating and not always entertaining. And the same is true if you have to make money or do all sorts of things. You see, if you say they're necessary, then you do them, right? See, I'm suggesting there's a reason for dialogue, right? We really need it, right? Now, so what is it? Now, see, this reason should be strong enough to get us through all that sort of frustration of some people dominating, some people not, finding it hard to talk and all that, and anxiety and all, right? Now, I'm saying we have to share meaning. You see, we can say a society, as I said, is a link of relationships among people and institutions so we can live together. But it only works with if we have a culture, which means we share meaning and purpose and value, right? Otherwise it falls apart. Our society is incoherent and doesn't do that very well. It hasn't done for a long time. And so now, how are we going to go about it? You see, when people first get together, if you have, say, 5 or 6 or 7 people, they can usually adjust to each other so that they don't say the things which would upset other people, right? Right? They sort of get a cozy adjustment. Or if there is a confrontation, it seems, with 1 or 2 people, it seems very hard to stop it, right? It gets stuck, you see. Now, if you raise the number to about 20, then something different begins to happen. Because from 20 to 40 is about as many as you can conveniently do in a circle. And we may put 2 circles concentrically. Now, there you begin to get what I call a microculture. You see, you have enough people coming in from different subcultures so that they're a kind of microcosm of the whole culture. Right? And therefore, some of the question of culture begins to come in, the shared meaning, right? Which is crucial because the collectively shared meaning is very powerful. It's more powerful. The collective thought is more powerful than the individual thought. In fact, the individual thought is mostly the result of collective thought anyway, interaction. And the language is entirely collective, and most of the thoughts in it are. Now, everybody does his own thing to those thoughts, but very few change them very much. Now, they make a contribution. Now, so we have the collective thought, and we're going to be... Dialogue is a way of exploring thought collectively, while we've been discussing ways of exploring it individually. The two really go together, right? We've got to do both sides. Now, in this dialogue, there are various... one of the things that will come up, the basic thing, is that we have different assumptions, right? As we have different backgrounds, as you were saying, therefore different assumptions. That's the same thing, right? People in one culture assume one thing, people in another one another. That's an extreme. But inside any culture, there are also very differences among the individuals and differences of subcultures in any country and so on. And therefore, we don't have the same assumptions, and that will interfere with communication, right? Because these assumptions are tacitly affecting the whole meaning of what we're doing, right? Now, now, assumptions also, we could say opinions are essentially the same thing. An opinion is an assumption which people tend to defend. Right? You can have opinions you don't defend. Like if you have a medical man, a doctor, he has a first opinion. Now, if he's a good doctor and it's a difficult case, he might call for a second opinion. Now, he's not expecting the second doctor to defend his opinion against his. That would be a waste altogether. He just wants another opinion, another point of view, to put the two opinions together, right? Now, but that is not the case usually when people have opinions, right? See, when they discuss and have opinions, they defend them, they impose them, right? They try to have some sort of to convince and persuade, to have a compulsive element in there, some sort of violence, right? In that, and and that prevents communication. You see, if we defend opinions, we're not going to be able to have a dialogue. Now, you're usually unconsciously defending your opinions. You don't do it usually on purpose. You may be conscious, but most of it is not, right? You feel this is so true that you can't avoid this, trying to convince this stupid person how wrong he is, right? And so on. Those opinions are often experienced as truths, right? They may be just your assumptions, your background, you got them from your teacher, your family, or by reading or whatever. But for one reason or another, you're identified with them and you're defending them, right? Now, this is the common state of affairs in our society, right? It means that any group of that size is not likely to get very far if they just suddenly start to try to have a dialogue. And you see, people talk about dialogues, but not the sense I'm using the word. You see, in the UN, they've had what are called dialogues, but they're not really discussing their fundamental assumptions. They're trading off minor points like how many, you can negotiate on some minor points like whether we have more or less nuclear weapons, but the whole difference of two social systems is not being seriously discussed, right? That's the cause of the trouble, you see. It's sort of taken for granted that you can't talk about that, right? That nothing will ever change that. Now, therefore the discussion is not serious, you see, not deeply serious, right? See, a great deal of it is what we call discussion is not really deeply serious in the sense that there are all sorts of things that are non-negotiable and not touchable, and you don't really want to talk about them, right? You could say that on the whole, if you're sort of defending your opinions, you're not serious. If you're trying to avoid something unpleasant inside of yourself, that's not serious either, right? You see, a great deal of our whole life is not serious, right? And society teaches you that. You see, it says, it teaches you not to be all that serious because it sort of implies anyway there's no point to it. There's nothing you can do about it anyway. You see, there are all sorts of incoherent things, and there's nothing that can be done about it. So you only stir yourself up by being serious, right? So there's a sort of a story. See, now in a dialogue, we've got to be serious, you see. They say it's not a dialogue if we're not in the way I'm using the word. There's a story about Freud that he had a cancer of the mouth, and somebody came up to him and wanted to talk to him about some point in psychology, but he said, perhaps I'd better not to talk to you because, you've got this cancer which is very serious. You may not want to talk about this. So his answer was, say, this cancer may be fatal, but it's not serious. We better. It's just about a lot of cells growing. You see and I think a great deal of what goes on in our society could be described that way. You see that it may well be fatal, but it's not serious. Now, the point about a dialogue is that we're would be serious in the sense that we really want to get at these assumptions. We want to be able to communicate, right? Even if we have to go through some things that may be a bit unpleasant and so on. So now I'm going to suggest the way it ought to work, which is what? That if we have a lot of assumptions, now assumptions will come up. And if you hear somebody else who has an assumption that seems outrageous to you, the natural response would be to, perhaps get angry or get excited. See, suppose you could suspend the activity, right, as we talked about suspending, and the individual, which means it's sort of there in front of you. You're not suppressing it, you're not carrying it out, you're not believing it or disbelieving it, but simply seeing the meaning of your assumption, the other person. You may have not even known you had an assumption. It was just because he came up with the opposite one that you find out you've got it, right? You see, and then there may be other assumptions in there. We're all suspending them and looking at them all, you see. What they mean and so on, you see. And
if you're suspending that judgment, you may have a chance to watch the impulse.
That's right, yes. In fact, you'll feel the impulse, you see. Your impulse is to do something, say something, right, and say, defend, right, to get in there. Yeah. Or else you may get another impulse that holds you back saying, I mustn't do it, I'll make a fool of myself, right? Yeah. You know that impulse too, right? So there's a whole bunch of impulses going on. And so now if we can all suspend our impulses, suspend our assumptions and look at them all and so on, then we are all in the same state of consciousness. The content is the same, right? And therefore we have, although established the thing which everybody wants, say common consciousness. It's not very pleasant, but we've got it, right? You see, See, people think of a state of common consciousness as a state of shared bliss, right? That may come, I don't know, but but the road to it is through this. I'm saying, you see that we have to share the consciousness that we've got, right? So we can't just impose another one, you see. Now, therefore, we have a common consciousness, and it shows, you see, not only in what people say, but in the stance of their bodies and so on. Everybody can see outwardly and inwardly what's going on. It's very similar, right? In spite of, everybody is very much the same, similar, because everybody's got different opinions. Everybody is similar in having a different opinion, right? Which is in conflict with another one. And now in that situation, some people may not be strongly attached to the opinions, and they can come in and diffuse the issue, you see, so it doesn't get too confrontational, you know, polarized, right? And now if people can stay with that and look at it, then a change can take place. You see, a common perception can take place, which is stronger because many people are involved, right? Because it's being reinforced both collectively and socially and individually, right? And because we're all so built that we tend to regard what everybody agrees on as true anyway. It builds up. You see, the collective often is troublesome because the group may act like a conscience or something people are afraid to oppose it. But this group we're aiming not at that group, you see, that condemns and judges and so on. You see, we're saying we all realize that that's going to get in the way, right? So we're saying this group is not aiming at any purpose. It's not going to judge or condemn. It's simply going to look at these opinions and assumptions and let them surface. And and I think that there will be a change. You see that there's a great deal of violence in these opinions, right, which you're defending. See, they're not merely opinions. They're not merely assumptions. They're assumptions with which you're identifying, which you're therefore defending, because as if you're defending yourself, right? So, see, in other words, the natural self-defensive impulse, which we got in the jungle, has been transferred from the jungle animals to these opinions, right? In other words, we say there are some dangerous opinions out there, just like there might be dangerous tigers, right? And there are some very precious animals inside that have to be defended, right? So, therefore, an impulse which makes sense there has been transferred here. We get to be aware of that, right? And now, I think that in that situation, there is a change. In fact, we can do this individually too. You see, we'll discuss that in the afternoon. You see, facing this sort of thing can be done both collectively and individually. Right? In fact, we ought to do both, right? Now, but something new comes in when you face it collectively, which is the whole cultural conditioning, right? You see, individually, it's very hard to be aware of it. You're surrounded by all the people of a very similar culture, and you therefore share these assumptions, and you don't know you've got them, right? But in a group of about 20 to 40, you're bound to have people with different assumptions and things they don't share. So the point is, we are facing the fact that we don't share our background, you see, entirely. We share a great deal, but it's enough to disagree on one point to blow it all up, right? The more we share, the quicker it'll blow up when there's one point that doesn't agree, right? So, now, what you will find, I'm going to say, here's what might happen, that this whole thing collapses and suddenly the feeling changes to one of fellowship and friendship, you see, namely participation, sharing. Because the fact is that when you're sharing all these opinions, we are all participating in the same thing, right? We are partaking of the common consciousness and we are taking part in it, right? And so you get that feeling we are participating, right? See, people can participate in hate too. You see, it's a very powerful bond. I mean, I remember many years ago I visited some people who had fled Nazi Germany. You see, had been anti-Nazi fighters, and they were living in Ireland, and they found it very tame and dull. You know, they said, you know, when we had the Nazis there, we really felt alive. You know, we hated each other. So, not that they wanted them back, but the thing is that this hate is a common bond which is very powerful. Now, if people could stay with this powerful violence or hate or whatever it is all the way to the end, then it sort of collapses because it hasn't, ultimately you see we're all the same, right? And therefore you have this participation and fellowship, and you can become friends, right? People who have gone through that could become good friends, right? And therefore they can really let the whole thing goes differently. They become more open to each other and trusting. And they've gone through that. You see, the thing that they're afraid of, they've already gone through, right? You see, so and the intelligence can then work. You see, as long as we have this defensive attitude and blocking and holding assumptions and sticking to them and saying, I've got to be right, and so on, then intelligence is very limited. You see, because intelligence requires you don't stick to an assumption. You see, there's no reason to stick to an assumption if there's evidence that it's not right. So you have to, an assumption, proper structure is it's open to evidence that it may not be right, or an opinion. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to impose the opinions of the group. You see, that everybody may have a different opinion or not. It's not that important. It isn't even necessary that everybody be convinced to have the same view, right? As long this sharing of mind of consciousness is more important than the opinions, right? And in fact, usually you'll see these opinions are limited anyway, and perhaps you will find that the answer is not in the opinions anyway, you see, somewhere else. You see that the truth does not emerge from those opinions, but it must emerge from something else, you know, a more free movement of this tacit mind. See, what happens is now that the tacit mind, we've talked about before, can be shared, right? It's shared not only in words, it's shared in body language. It's shared in ways that are very subtle, right? And therefore people can think together. You see, when you hold opinions, you cannot think together, right? With somebody, you see, but thinking together means A says something and B can pick it up and carry it along just as if it were his own thought. C does it, D, and so on. So that is clearly this kind of mind needed to deal with social problems, right? You see, if our legislatures could think together, they would be able to make an intelligent response to whatever's going on.
Well, would it be appropriate here to say that what you're suggesting is considerably more difficult than climbing Mount Everest?
Yes, but I think, I do not see any way for the human race to be viable in the long run if we can't do it. You see, I mean, we may last 100 years, 200, 500, I don't know, but it's not viable with high technology. If we can manage to return to something like the Stone Age, we might go on all right. Provided that 99% of us agree to leave the field, so the remaining 1% can live in Stone Age technology.
As difficult as it may sound, I think dialogue does occur occasionally. Quite a few of us have taken part in discussions which occasionally became dialogues. I think one can, after a certain while, distinguish certain phases of gatherings of this sort. One phase is, the first one is when they come together, we all very polite and feel at each other and see who says what, who thinks what. The second phase is, if we keep long enough, is that there will be some people who expose their notions and ideas relatively strongly. I think this phase is a very important one, that like the lady over there, when she comes and says, well, I don't understand this and I think this is a very important phase of dialogue, that people expose what they have in their mind, not just as a loose set of questions, but as they actually feel about it, psychologically moving with it, and so on. Now, this generally goes into a lot of zigzags. And I suggest this whole process, as we look at it, is very much same as the creative process, if we follow it through. Now, this zigzag then is the various opinions of people coming to clash. I think this, you think that, and so on. How come? And comes this evangelizing urge to convince each other of our absolutes. Now, the next phase is an outright chaos. You know, the most valuable phase of this whole thing. when we all feel that this whole thing is not worth doing. And how many times have we felt it, right? Now, two things we do about it. Comes a good leader or facilitator and says, let's organize this thing. This just cannot go any further. So we fragment each other into various little groups, and we think that this will work. The only thing we have done now, the groups have these different views and opinions. They go into various fights. Or we plainly turn our backs to it and say, well, this is not it, it's not worth doing, and so on. Now, if we survive the chaos, if we go through by whatever external force or internal urge and so on, comes one of the most beautiful things. The coming out from the chaos is the letting go, the dropping our views, the yielding to saying, well, I'm really not too sure after all, and for the sake of maybe getting out from this, my neck is on the table now, so let's just whole thing float. Let's see what happens. If this stage arrives after it, something quite beautiful happens. And that is, the Bible comes to my mind when Jesus says that if two or more of you come together in my name, I will be in the midst of you. And that's exactly the feeling which comes, where it is there is a sense of love and care, a certain brotherhood in which it doesn't matter anymore too much what you say. It is this atmosphere which becomes important. It is this sense of being together, quite independent of your opinions, but of course that's included. I will listen to you. I can even tell you are a fool, and so on. And you can tell me the same. This is the kind of atmosphere. If it comes about, it is the most fertile land in which then you can start with anything. Any thought matters. The important thing which then remains that you and I are together in a very deep sense of this thing. We are not separate from yet our opinions are different, and so on. And I think to survive this chaotic state, and probably this chaotic state has to be certain kind, maybe properly facilitated, I don't know exactly what it is, brings about something so memorable that itself, that if you wish, experience of togetherness will then make the situation go on and survive new chaoses, new ups and downs. I think this very process is actually very much what one can individually sense, the creative process. That's how new ideas come about individually. We go into it with some assertion, that's how it goes, that's what it should be. Then we find an obstacle, and the thing collapses. Then zigzags arise. I, as an engineer, go through this over and over again. And then I get lost. It's a chaos. I don't know what to do. And then somewhere, sometimes, when I am really let go, the idea pops from nowhere. But the important thing is that idea pops in a background, a feeling, a certain deep sense of meaning and intelligence and love. All these things is behind it, and it pops out from that. And from there on, oh yeah, this is it. And I think that's the same thing which can occur, or similar thing can occur in a group environment.
Yes, well, that's a very good outline of the whole process. I would only add that that I think that they knew that what it amounts to is getting free of the domination of this abstract verbal process and allowing the tacit process to take over. But the tacit process is common; it is shared. Right? The sharing is not merely the explicit communication, which is part of it, and the body language and all that, but there is a tacit process which is common. And I think the whole human race knew this for 1 million years, and then with 5,000 years of civilization, we have lost it because it got too big to carry out. And now, but we have to get started again, you see, because it's become urgent that we have to communicate. We have to be in sharing we have to share our consciousness and to be able to think together, you see, in order to do whatever is necessary so intelligently. And the suggestion is that people could start dialogue groups in various places. Don't identify with the group. You see, that's not the point. It's this whole process. You're liable to say this is a wonderful group or something, but you see, it's the process that counts. And saying even there's no point in keeping up a particular group indefinitely. Maybe you have to keep it up a while, or else it won't work, as you were explaining. Maybe a year or two or so on. It's important to sustain it, right, regularly. And if you sustain it, all these problems will arise. You see, the frustration will arise, the sense of chaos, the sense it's not worth it. And also, if you understand that you have to stick with it nevertheless, which is the same as Mount Everest or whatever, then something new will come, you see. Now, this new thing, I think, will open the way to changing this whole situation, you see, ecologically or whatnot. You see that people have, for example, the ecological movement now, the green movement, is in danger of fragmenting and splitting because they all have many of them have different opinions about how to deal with this. So they can fight each other as much as they fight for the ecology. Now, it's therefore particularly urgent, I think, that the green movement must get into dialogue.
It's even expressing itself violently in some aspects, like in the northern states, where some of the so-called environmental groups have been attacking forests and spiking trees and things of that nature.
What do they do? I mean, yeah.
They put spikes in trees, which cause problems when you're about to cut them down.
Yes, I was reading also that they begin to attack cattle in isolated farms and so on. You know. Well, you see, then there are other. See, that's one group, and another group says no, that's wrong. See, so the trouble is not so much what they're doing, but the real trouble is it splits the whole thing and makes it ineffective, right? Now,
So you're saying the splitting is a violent action, and it's perpetrated by a violent.
there's a violent impulse, do you see?
Violent impulse.
You see, which there's a violent thought behind it, right? Or sustaining it, right?
Well, would they have a dialogue then? Generally you talk about dialogue, just people saying whatever they want to say. But in that case, they'd have a dialogue about the environmental.
You can do it in a more limited way. I think it would be best if they would accept the principle, let it be open, you see. But if they're not ready to do that, let's do it what we can. Now, because when you limit it, you're accepting some assumptions on the basis of which you limit it, and therefore you're not looking at them, right? Now, I think that you see, this green movement is both a kind of window of opportunity, because people can see at this moment how dangerous the situation is. It sort of hit them, right? Now, if something doesn't happen, it's going to gradually close. The whole thought process is always working the way we described, to make you feel more comfortable and make you forget about it, right? And unless something happens, that's very likely to take place, you see. Now, it is essential, I think that the people who want to do this are going to be, that purpose is conducive to dialogue anyway. But it has to get going, you see.
I have a question. I've been in several dialogue groups, but never in a sustained one with more than 20 people. It seems that there's a very common assumption that people have that it's not very important to have more than 20. And yet I have a sense that it is important. Could you speak to that?
Yes, it is. You can do it with less, but there's a certain important point that occurs when you get between 20 and 40. Right? Now, the point is, you first of all get enough points of view to constitute a microculture. So you begin to really face the question of cultural diversity and what the culture is. You see, you're not. If you have too few people, you're not really getting into cultural questions very much. And the basic difficulty is cultural. You see, the attitude to the nature is a cultural question, for example. And now, the second point is the power of the thing goes up. You see, a large number of people has a tremendous psychological power. That is why people are afraid to talk in a large group. They feel the disapproval of a large group has a tremendous power. But also that means that if the group is working right, that has another kind of power. See, I think it would create, it's a microcosm of a different culture and of a different kind of mind. Now, I don't think that we can do this very greatly. See, if one or two people do transform in their minds, it's a limited significance, right? Now, if you get a microculture transforming, which can in principle, spread by going to other groups and so on, then you see the principle of the change of culture has been established, right? Now, it's like saying when they first had nuclear fission, you said there were only a few uranium atoms doing this, so it didn't look very important. But the principle was established, which was universal, so the significance of a change of culture, which means a change of shared consciousness, right? Shared meaning. I think that you take a group of a certain size to establish that significance.
Well, there is another aspect of it. We have a natural example of a dialogue group, which I say the family is. You have the cultural diversity. Actually, you have all kinds of a diversity in a family. And in fact, most of my experience in dialogue is from my family, where such thing as this shared common meaning and the sense of a love, compassion for each other occasionally has been established. So I think the notion that it has to be large, I don't know, maybe we think too much of the results. We have to change society, but rather, I think first the very sense of what is a community, what is a dialogue, what is to be together is far more important than get to the results. And in that sense, family is, for example, a natural thing. Friendship is a natural location for such thing to start.
But it seems that most families are not capable of dialogue.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, of course.
I think for a number of times that partly what gets in the way of a dialogue is being personal. I have never understood the difference between being personal and impersonal in a dialogue.
I don't know if that's
is personal or
I don't think of that as a key question. I don't know that. I think the thing that gets in the way of dialogue is to holding to assumptions or opinions, right? And defending them. Now, if you're identified personally with an opinion, then that would get in the way, right? You see, if you're identified collectively with an opinion, it gets in the way too, right? That I think the difficulty is that we cannot listen really properly to another opinion because we're resisting it. We don't really hear it.
An aspect of that, I think, is that we engage in an activity like this, but this personal opinion that I have is much more important than this activity. And I haven't understood, and I don't know how I do come to understand that this activity that I engage in is far more important than my personal opinion.
That's true. I mean, not only my personal, but I might be identified with a large group like my country or even my family or various groups which have their own opinion, which have their own views, right? And I would feel impelled to defend that, right? Saying I represent this group, right? I must defend, right? So, therefore, I'm saying that any identification of your opinion with anything doesn't make sense, right? And this other thing is far more important, as you say, right? That many people will identify opinions with their personality, but it's not really that. You see, like there was this example of we had a kind of a beginning of a dialogue in Israel where we were talking about various things, and somebody said, just in passing, that the trouble is that Zionism is interfering with the relationships of Jews and Arabs. He said it very quietly. And then suddenly somebody else got up with his eyes popping out. He said, but without Zionism the country would go to pieces. Now, it was not his personal opinion only, right? It was, he felt identified with that whole body of opinion, right? And because it was such a big body, he defended it even more, right? So I think that the question is the defense of opinion, and this requires, the other point is that if we're going to have a dialogue, there's no place in the dialogue for the principle of authority and hierarchy, you see. That may be necessary to run a society, you see, we have to set up all that to run things, but we need a place where there's no authority, no hierarchy, where there's no special purpose, like sort of an empty place, and where we can let anything be discussed.
Let's see what you're suggesting
Right.
is a group of people come together,
Yeah.
essentially without motive, and engage in a task which is tremendously difficult, and give up their opinions, when really all they're mostly concerned about is their personal problems. They can't get along with their wife or whatever.
Yeah.
And so why would we come to feel this tremendous
Well, that-
necessity?
Well, yes, you pointed to the difficulty of sustaining a dialogue, right? You see, what you say is quite true. It's not all that easy in our society to sustain a dialogue. Now, but still, let's think about it and say it does seem to be necessary to have this dialogue, whether we have it in the family if we can, we could have it with our friends if we can, but I think there's an important advantage in a larger group. And we've got to have this process of dialogue, or else the whole thing is going to go to pieces. Like I said, without the glue or the cement, it all goes to pieces. You see, unless we share meaning, it'll become chaos, as it is becoming, right? You see, throughout the whole world we have this vast set of things going on, and everybody defends his opinion, and nobody can really be serious, right?
And it would seem that the impulse to dialogue is there. There are a few people in this room who keep coming back, despite the fact that there may be an element of frustration involved in trying to institute this.
It feels very real. It's not.
Is the problem that we have difficulty engaging in something that is purposeless?
Well, that's part of our prejudices of one of the assumptions of society is we've got to have a purpose to get together, right? It's sort of a tacit assumption.
If there was a purpose, it would not be a dialogue.
Yeah, no, I'm saying if you insist on that, we'll perhaps do it that way, but it's better, the less purpose you define, the better, right?
And we have, like you were saying, most of our motivations are quite self-motivated, so if I could come here and get something, that would be, I'd travel thousands of miles, but to come here to get nothing, people would think.
Well, no, but you are getting something is happening. I'm
Well,
suggesting.
not that something isn't happening, but that I can't, it is that there's not a tangible.
Yeah, but that's what I'm trying to say, that the subtle is the real, the subtle is the ground of everything, and the thing you can put your hand on is not all that important, you see.
But we are totally unaware of that.
I'm saying we have to turn upside down the values of our society. You see, that's where the trouble is. We are returning to a set of values closer to the one in which the human race evolved for 1 million years. It's probably built into us that those are more natural values.
When you talk about the hunter-gatherer societies that used to come together in groups of 20 or 40, that evidently probably wasn't the purpose other than
Just go to live together. 20 is the smallest group that's viable, and 40 is about the largest that'll work, I think.
You know, I wonder whether there isn't a purpose, but it's in a tacit place. See, what we look for is a purpose in the intellect or verbal, or something tangible. But there may be, just for the sake of expressing it, there may be actually a purpose for this planet to continue or whatever,
Oh, yeah,
on a much
yeah.
larger scale. And in fact, if we come here with a motive for the me, and we move in the intangible, it may in fact come back to the me, but not in the area that I would think it would, not from where I would imagine it in my content, but it may actually improve me anyway,
Yeah.
but not the self. the
Well, it
life.
won't be the kind of improvement that our society
Imagine.
recognizes,
Yeah.
acknowledges.
Right, right.
You see, it's an entirely cultural, social question. Our society and our culture have certain values as to what it's worth doing, the kind of thing we ought to do and so on, which we hardly even state, we know so well. And this goes against it all, you see. Now, I'm saying, why should you go against it all? Because it's necessary. If you, for some reason which, is deeper, in a sense, if you want in the sense if it's of value to you that the human race should survive in a good life and so on and fulfill its creative capabilities, then this, I say, is necessary. That's the proposal.
If the human race is not viable, if we don't learn how to do this, there doesn't seem to be any good reason to give it up.
Give up what?
To give up dialogue. You're suggesting that
Yeah.
the survival of the species depends on our ability to do this, to some extent.
Yeah.
Or our inability to do this is threatening our survival.
And also, if we do survive, it's going to be pretty miserable, you see.
Yeah.
We don't want to be miserable, right?
Also, it's very interesting, when I come to these sessions, people say, well, what's the session going to be about? And I say, well, I really don't know. And then I go home, and they say, well, what did Dr. David Bohm say? And I say, I don't really know.
Yeah. Well, yes, well, that's the same thing again, that it's against the whole values of the society. They say if there's not something you can point to, then it has no value, right?
We say it was more diffusive than productive. It actually diffuses. This dialogue seems to have a tendency to diffuse or to dissipate a lot of commonly held beliefs.
Yeah.
Which may not give rise to a new belief, but it has dissipated.
Yeah, but I think that it will work in this tacit level of mental process, right? That where everything takes place anyway, right?
Sometimes it seems like a really strongly held opinion is held. It may be true. It's just that the person is holding it so strongly because they don't really understand why it's so true or what's so true about it. But then if the energy is taken down, they could get a better vision of what's so true about their opinion and can communicate it without all that heat and passion.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether I know it, but then you have to listen to what the other person says that it may not be true.
Right, and then allow that to.
That's
shape
where you
it
have to
too.
listen. Yeah. I think we'll have one or two more questions, and we must close. Right?
Yeah.
I wonder, I've been hearing this phrase, the tacit ground, the tacit basis for which all things are functioning anyway. And earlier you were talking about getting in touch with the concrete activity of thinking. I'm wondering, what is the proper relationship of thought to this tacit ground? What is going on?
Well, the thought is emerging from the tacit ground, just as the bicycle riding emerges, right? You see that any change in thought will come from the tacit ground. So if we are communicating at the tacit ground, then maybe thought is changing. Right, well, we must close it soon. I think we must close because lunch.